Starting off on this piece, because I knew I was going to be airbrushing the background, I took masking fluid and went around the edge of the tiger drawing. After that, I used frisket to fill in the inside. Now, normally when I use masking fluid, I just fill in the entire subject. I couldn't do that this time though, because this paper is lighter weight and I knew it would warp really bad. So to avoid that, I just went ahead and went around the edges. That's the yellow that you're seeing there. The black lines you're seeing are just my marker lines so that I knew where to cut out my frisket. Frisket's basically just a big piece of low tack tape. For airbrushing my background, I am using createx paints as usual, and I'm just kind of blocking in where the trees are going to go. I'm using a mixture of brown and black for this. And I'm just keeping it very, very soft like I did on the tutorial from last week where I kept the airbrush kind of far away from the canvas, or in this case the paper, so that I didn't get too much detail in there. If you get the airbrush too close, your lines end up too sharp and you lose that blurry effect. Now, I'm not normally going to be doing these tutorials every week until I get my computer system upgraded, so that is milestone number 2 for us here on Patreon. But this one, being that it is in colored pencil, I know that a lot of you guys have wanted one of those with the voiceover, so that's what you're getting today. This will be your month of April tutorial. The rest of the Patreon videos for this month will not have voiceovers, as usual. Now, whenever I do these blurry backgrounds, I do those little dots a lot. It just gives it kind of a sparkly feel. And when I'm finished, it won't have that many dots, but it just gives, it's one easy way as I build up to get a fair amount of depth when I'm doing leaves and stuff like leaves, bushes, anything like that. Using a magenta color to go over that now for what I'm guessing are cherry blossoms. I don't know. Now I'm using a second magenta type color. It's darker. It's really important whenever you're doing trees, whether you're doing a blurry background or just creating trees that are up close where you're seeing all of that detail, use several tones. Don't just use one tone of light green, one of dark green, and call it done. Use a lot of tones. Here's my 4th shade of pink now, a much darker magenta. This is going to give you a lot more depth than if you just do the one color. If you do the one or two colors, it looks pretty flat. So this is whether you're working in paint, airbrush, colored pencil, use a lot of colors. Now I'm coming through with, I've added a little bit of black to that color, so I'm even darker. I think that makes it my, what, 5th color? I don't know, can't count, not paying attention. Now I'm using the dark color too to build up more of those little bushy tree things, technical terms there, and going over some of the tree trunks to better define them. A few highlights with white. And if you don't have an airbrush, you can do all of this with colored pencil or whatever medium you're working in. It's not going to be quite as soft, but you can get pretty close. Just do a lot of layering. I like using the airbrush because it saves tons of time. And I do like the look. Okay, now I'm going around my edges. I've removed the masking fluid and I found that this paper is horribly warped after that. I'm not sure which warped it worse, the airbrush or the masking fluid. The tiger itself was what was warped so badly, which was really weird. I've never had paper that wouldn't go back into shape after it dried when I've used either the airbrush or masking fluid. Nothing would get this paper back into shape, and as I work, you can kind of see the paper keeps moving. It's just warped so badly. The whole paper buckled. So I'm going through now and thinning out where any of the little whiskers or eyelash guys are. Better defining those. That had masking fluid on it to keep the paper white, but the masking fluid I put on really thick, so now I've got to thin that out. And I'm just layering several colors to do this so that it blends in and looks like a part of the background, because I don't want you to be able to tell any difference between airbrushed areas and colored pencil areas. And I'm mostly using the polychromos for that. Now working around my edges, I'm basically doing the same thing as I did on the little eyebrow guys. I'm calling them eyebrow guys because I don't know what they're actually called, those little hairs. But I'm going around the edges and softening that where it transitions from where the colored pencil is and where the airbrush is. If I overlap that, it makes it blend more seamlessly. Working on the ear, I've started with the lighter areas inside the ear. Now I'm coming back on with the dark portions, which makes it easier for me to judge the values on my light areas. Now this is where I really started seeing my second issue with the paper. The first was that it warped and buckled so badly. The second is that I was having such a hard time getting color saturation on here. That black pencil, the amount of pressure that I was using here was pretty heavy, which should have gone really dark, and it just wasn't. You can see that it's very grainy. It's just not getting the saturation that I'm used to getting on any other quality paper. This stuff was horrible to work on. I wasted so much time just fighting the paper, trying to get color saturation, and then trying to get it flattened back out every time it would warp and buckle. And it wasn't just from using any type of wet media like the masking fluid, the airbrush, my mind just shut off, the airbrush paint, or the paint thinner. Those will cause paper to warp, but they normally will dry back into place if you've got it taped down like I do here. This paper, it did not want to dry back into place. So that was a big issue for me. But the next big issue was just that I couldn't get good color saturation. It was very similar to working on Bristol vellum, but you basically had all of the negatives of working on Bristol vellum with none of the positives. The negatives being that it is hard to get color saturation on there. It's a bit too smooth, and I tend to get a more grainy look when I work on the vellum than I do when I work on the Fabriano Artistico that I normally use. Blending with the paint thinner. Every time I need white, you'll see I always switch over to my Luminance white. The polychromos white is just being oil-based. It is too translucent, and it doesn't get the saturation, like it's not opaque enough for me. So that's why you will always see me switch over to Luminance whenever I need white. Whenever I airbrush a background like this, I have to spend extra time focusing on those edges to make sure that they blend in seamlessly. I'm using my black polychromos to put in the stripes on the tiger, and this is something that I normally do if I'm doing a big cat or even an owl where I need a lot of dark feathers or dark lines throughout. I will put those black lines in first just to block them in, and even though I had them sketched out in pencil, they're just so easy to lose, and it makes it hard for me to judge the rest of my values. So I like to get my darks in first. Well, not all of the darks, but the darkest values I will get in first, and then go back and work on my light areas, and then come back and darken up the darker areas again. But I normally will put in those darks before I get working on, in this case, the oranges and tans. Now it's really important, and you guys hear me say this all the time, pay attention to the direction of your fur. I can't stress that enough. If your lines are going not in the same direction that the fur moves, the whole shape of the animal is going to be completely wrong. The direction of the fur is what indicates the bone and muscular structure underneath, so really pay close attention there. As always, when I'm working in colored pencil, I'm using a really light hand. You don't want to push really hard early on, or you end up flattening out your paper, which is kind of silly because paper is already too flat, so it doesn't take many layers anyway. But if you flatten your paper out too early, you limit how many layers that the paper is able to take, which can cause problems later on. So I always use a very, very light hand. I do my blending early on with paint thinner because that's not going to damage the paper or flatten it out anymore. But keeping that light hand, it makes it much, much easier for you. Onto the whiskers, I'm doing the same thing I did on the upper little hairs that stick out and thinning them out. And you don't want whiskers to be straight white. Even the white whiskers are going to be semi-translucent, and so you're going to see colors through them and behind them and shadows on them and all kinds of stuff like that. So leaving them flat white would look very flat. So it's important that you get other colors in there too. And I will end up coming through later on in the piece with my white luminance and throwing in additional whiskers, which are going to be a little bit of a different color than the white paper that I have here, which is great because it gives it more depth. Like some of those whiskers are farther away because they're shaded differently. Now people ask me all the time, how do you get the white whiskers on an animal to show up? The thing with that, when you're working in colored pencil, it's very different with paint. With paint, we just use white paint because white's opaque and throw the whiskers in on top of whatever else we have. With colored pencil, it's backwards. You have to plan for those whiskers in the first place and leave that paper white. If you fill in the paper with any other color, don't expect it to go back to completely white again. So in this case, well, here I've used the masking fluid to keep the paper white, but when I use to move on to the whiskers on the inside of the face, I'm going to use my white Luminance pencil. If you are using Prismacolor or a wax-based pencil, I would use that. The wax works better for what I'm talking about here. But I will put in, you can see here, the white first. That way, as I blend and work on the rest of it, even if I get color on top of it accidentally, that white is there first, so I'm kind of protecting the paper from getting oversaturated with other color once I start working. So having that white, it's just kind of like a protectant there. I will end up with other colors that blend into it once I start blending with the paint thinner, which is okay, as long as I keep that really light. That is the point there. Again, blocking in the darker areas. Pay super close attention to your reference photo. You don't want to just start putting dark areas in randomly or it won't look right. Every little sketchy line that I'm making follows the direction of the fur. Normally when I work in colored pencil, if I'm going for a really smooth look, I'll do teeny tiny little circles and just keep overlapping them so that everything just blends seamlessly. Here, where I'm working on fur, I am using a more sketchy hand, straight lines or slightly curved lines back and forth to create the texture of the fur. But when you're doing that, you just really have to pay attention to the direction of the fur and the length of the fur. The further in on the face and closer to the muzzle or bridge of the nose that you get, the shorter the fur is going to be on these guys. That's something to definitely watch for. You can see as I'm working in by the whiskers, I'm working in between each whisker. I'm not going over the whisker. I'm being very, very careful to leave those white. Working on the ear, and apparently need to adjust my camera angle. I've got a new tripod. Well, it's not really a tripod. It's actually a mic stand with a boom arm thing for getting better angles for recording these videos, but I'm still kind of learning how best to position that to give you guys the best view. Again, just building up those lines and making sure to go in between. Just working my way through the last areas of these dark portions. And the nice thing is some of the areas that I'm doing in here, they're not technically going to be black. They're not parts of the stripes. They're just dark. But because I'm using a light hand, that's okay because I'm going to layer other colors on top of it. So I can just almost be lazy here and use black for my shadows, but with a very light hand. That way when I put the browns and reds over it later, they'll still be dark, but it's not going to be black where it shouldn't be. However, if I had used a heavy hand for all of these black areas, that would have been an issue later on because the browns and the reds wouldn't have shown up good enough over them. Now that that's on, I can come up and start working on the ear. I'm going around the edges, and you want to make sure when you're working on ears, don't skip over this part. It's something that I see a lot of artists do, whether it be on animals or people. I know ears don't seem terribly exciting, so we don't want to spend a ton of time on them, but we need to. We've got to spend that time, and we have to really pay attention because the weakest area of our painting, it really will drag down the rest of the piece. It's important that you pay really close attention to every little bit of your painting and really match it up with your reference photo. Get all of that detail in there if it calls for detail. And so much is going on the inside with this ear. The other ear, because of the angle, you don't see a lot, so that one went pretty fast, but this ear that's facing us, tons and tons of detail, so it is important to watch out for that. And if this is if this is a project that you want to do, this tiger, I got the reference photo from wildlifereferencephotos.com. You can make up your own background and it will be your very own and different from anyone else's, but the tiger itself, you can still use the techniques that I'm using for completing yours. The reference photo was really good. I was able to see all of these little details, and it's a great angle. When choosing a reference photo, that's something that you really want to watch for. Make sure that it's a good angle so that it's going to translate well into the painting, because so often the photos that are make for cute photos don't make for the best paintings. Softening all of that out with my Mona Lisa odorless paint thinner. Now you can see the black area on this ear that is closest to the right side of the ear. That is very, very light. Normally with the black that I put on, once I go over it with paint thinner, that would have been a lot darker. This paper, I just had such a hard time getting decent color saturation. I was not pleased with the results here. I'm fairly happy with the end result of my final painting, but I had to fight to get there, and I think it would have been a lot better had I used a higher quality paper where I could have gotten more layers, and it would have made it a lot easier to get some of the detail that I wanted. I find when working on vellum, while this isn't vellum, it essentially is just a lightweight vellum. The surface feels exactly the same to work on to me. But I find when working on vellum, I tend to get a more grainy, gritty look because it just doesn't take the layers well. The color doesn't saturate into the paper like it does when I use the Fabriano Artistico. So I end up fighting with this grainy, gritty look, which some people love. It's not a look that I like, and it's one of the reasons that I personally don't work on vellum normally anymore. I did for many years. I'm just paying close attention to that little teeny detail. And I'm using the white pencil to get some of those hairs in. Those hairs aren't going to be white again because I have color underneath it, but they are going to be lighter, and you're still going to see the texture of the fur there, which is what I want because I don't want those white. If I needed any of these areas in this ear to stay white, I would have needed to leave the paper blank so that the white of the paper showed through. That's the only way you're really going to get a lot of like that strong white with colored pencil. And it's one of the reasons that I personally only work on white paper. I do have some black paper here I want to play around with, but it's not something that I would do normally because I feel I can get my whites when I do want that strong white. I can get them so much more bold when I'm using white paper that I can let show through than with tinted paper. Now I'm using the white on the ear, and again, it's white, it's light, but it's really, if you used an eyedropper tool like a color picker in Photoshop, you would see that's actually a fairly dark gray, but the white is letting the texture of those little hairs show through. Now I'm coming back through with a darker pencil, and I think that's a dark sepia, but I'm coming through and building up more detail in there. Now I'm using masking tape with a pencil to pull a little bit of that off so that I can get a few more details in there. If you're unfamiliar with using masking tape with colored pencil, I do have a video showing exactly how to do that, and I will put a link in the description so you guys can check that out. Everywhere where I pulled off some of the colored pencil with the masking tape, I just go back over it with a white pencil to sharpen it up. Now I am using a cream color because of the way the light shows through here. I want to make sure to leave it really light. One thing that a lot of people will do, they'll look at a tiger or a leopard or whatever it is and they'll think, okay, that's orange, and they'll use an orange pencil to get the color, and that's generally not going to work out so well for you. There are a lot of colors in here that you're going to want to use, and in this case, because it's so light, I've got to use a color that's very, very pale. It will fade off into the reds and the browns, but I don't want to start off too dark. You want to really watch when you're picking your colors. Don't just look at something and go, okay, it's orange, I'm going to use an orange pencil. Be very careful with that. What I like to do is keep a scratch piece of paper of whatever type of paper I'm using next to me so that I can test out what those colors are going to look like when I layer them. With colored pencil, we do a lot of layering, so we need to have a fairly good idea of what those colors are going to look like when we do layer them on top of each other. And it's important to use the same kind of paper that you're working on because each paper is going to take different layers differently. Like you can see on this one where I've talked about I'm not getting the color saturation. I wouldn't want to test it on Fabriano and then come over here because the results are going to be very different. So use the same kind of paper you're working on to do those little tests. What you just saw me do, And I just softened up those edges. That ink eraser works really well for colored pencil. That one's by Faber-Castell. They make one. The one that they make here that they sell in the US looks like it has a cream color paint on the wood casing. My mind keeps shutting off. But the one that you see me use all the time with the lime green, I get that one from Mexico. It's a lot less expensive, and it doesn't have the stupid little brush handle on the end that the ones they sell here in the US have. Okay, on to the eye. I am starting with a grayish green color. I love the Luminance pencils. They have so many of these natural colors that have this grayish tint, which is a very natural, I mean, grayish greens, grayish blue, grayish purple. I love some of the colors available in the Luminance lines. Once I blocked that in, I blended it with paint thinner. Now I'm using my polychromos black pencil. Whenever I want fine detail, I'm going to use my polychromos black pencil. It just, well, when I need black, I mean. The polychromos, being that they sharpen to such a fine point, it's so nice for getting lots of detail. Blending the grays around the edges there. Now, that one, because of the way the light is hitting it, that eye needs to stay really light. Now, anywhere where the fur is technically white on the animal, I'm filling it in with white colored pencil first, but I'm going to come back on top of that with grays and creams and other colors. I'm not going to leave it white. But the reason that I put the white down first is that way I can come back through with either the masking tape or an eraser, and I can lift colors where I need it to create more of a hair texture. It's kind of doing it in reverse. That white pencil will protect the paper so that it doesn't get oversaturated with color. When I blend with paint thinner, it pushes all of that color, it kind of melts it into the paper. But if I have white on there first, it's easier to lift some of that color up later when I'm creating more texture with the fur. There's that grayish purple color I was talking about a minute ago. I use that all the time. It's one of my favorite pencils. And that one is by Luminance. I believe it's called Gray Lavender or Gray Violet, something like that. I've got to pay attention to where the camera is angled when I'm working, because apparently I'm working below the camera right now. Using paint thinner to blend that out. Now, one of the things that a lot of people will do when they try blending with paint thinner, they'll put 1 or 2 layers of colored pencil down, they'll blend with paint thinner and say, well, it doesn't look like yours. I am putting like 5 layers, and then I'm blending with paint thinner, and then I'm putting another 5 layers, and I'm blending with paint thinner, and another 5 layers. I end up with about 20 layers on any piece, except for this one because it wouldn't take layers. But normally I use a lot of layers to get that really painted look. The first few layers still look like crayon, even when I blend with the paint thinner. So when you want that look, it takes a lot of layers and a lot of patience. I'm starting to add some of the deeper reds into the fur. And this, when I talked about having issues with color saturation on this paper, this was really where I noticed the biggest issue. When I wanted to get some of these deeper reds and browns, colors that come out, like I've done quite a few tigers in colored pencil, so I pretty much know which colors I'm going to use to get the tones that I want. Those tones were almost impossible to get on this paper. Using the same exact pencils that I use on other brands of paper, I just couldn't get the same results over here. They were just so, everything was so muted on this. I'm starting with a much lighter color on that fur than I'm going to need. When you're doing stripes on a tiger or even the spots on a leopard, pay attention to where those are. Don't just put them randomly all over. It will not look right. I'm laying the white down again to protect that paper so that when I come on top with other colors, I don't go too dark. And for the soft areas around the eyes and on the bridge of the nose, I'm mostly working in little circles just to keep it very, very even. When I'm building up and pretty much anything in colored pencil, I start very lightly. I'm just blocking in approximately where all of my lights and darks are going to go. Now I am blending the black and the orange areas. Here, because I knew I needed to go darker and I knew I was having problems getting color saturation on this paper anyway, I blended the black right over into the oranges. I let that smudge together, and that will muddy up your colors, but for what I needed here, it was okay. However, if you're doing an area where you need your black to not smear into your other colors, like towards your final layers, you want to be more careful and blend the black separately when you use paint thinner than where you're blending your oranges or your other colors, because that paint thinner will pull that black into all of those other colors. You can definitely very easily get muddy colors if you're not watching what you're doing. Coming back through with that reddish brown to try to brighten some of these up. Now normally on any other paper, the work that I've done here, it would look like I was a lot farther along than what I'm having on this paper. If you work on vellum and you're not sure how your colors aren't coming out as bold as mine are, that's probably why. It's more the paper. I mean, some of it will have to do with technique for sure, but if you're doing the same things I am and your color's not coming out the same, it's probably the paper. Now you can see as I'm working on this eye, as I work, the paper keeps bending and moving. That was the most frustrating thing working on this. And I kept taking the embossing gun to try to stretch the paper or shrink it back into place, and it would work to an extent, but as soon as I would start working in colored pencil again, even if I wasn't using the paint thinner, if I was just burnishing, the paper would stretch right back out. It was horrible, horrible. So that eye, I have lots of colors in there. I've got a grayish green color, I've got that reddish brown, I've got oranges, I've got creams, lots of colors in that eye. Notice it's darker up under the upper eyelid than it is towards the bottom of the eye. That eye's not finished. I'll come back and add the highlights and some more layers. I'm just waiting for it to dry from the paint thinner, which normally only takes a few seconds. I'm adding grays over the white now to start creating depth. You don't want to leave your white areas just white. I know I keep saying that, but it's so important. Even though I put white down first, I'm not leaving everything white. Adding the highlights to the eye with the white and then coming back through again, working on shadows around the eye. I jump around a lot as I work in each area because I'll be working on the eye and then notice, oh, up here I want to darken this on the forehead, and then I'll jump back down and work on the eye. I jump all over the place. You don't have to work that way. It's just how my mind works. Darkening up these stripes. Now on any other brand of paper, how dark I had those stripes before I blended last time would have stayed dark. I wouldn't have really needed to keep going over it like I am here. I had to keep reworking areas just to get the color dark enough. I'm using the white to make the white areas fade into the red or orange areas of the fur. I use the white pencil a lot when just creating texture in the fur, creating the little hairlines. It's not going to be white white. It will still have the color underneath because all of these pencils are somewhat translucent. Even the more opaque white with the Luminance, you're still going to see colors through it. I have people ask me all the time, do you work on a reference photo or do you work out of your mind? When you're working on something that is super realistic like this, you need reference photos. No one's going to remember every little detail on something like this, how to make the fur move, how to get the fur going in the right direction. You can do that if you're working more impressionistically or have a very looser style. You can kind of get away with that once you've done these a lot of times. But realistically, when you're doing this type of detail, you're always going to want a good reference photo. It's funny to me now watching myself work on this and see how bad that paper keeps moving. That is not normal. You can see when I push on one area of the paper, the opposite area buckles up. It was so horrible. And this was taped down. That should not be happening like this. One tip that you can do when you want to keep your pencil sharp and you don't want to keep sharpening with the pencil sharpener or the razor blade, keep a piece of sandpaper next to you and you can sand the tip of the pencil. So as the pencil starts to get dull, but there's still enough lead sticking out on there, you can use the sandpaper to sharpen it up. Pretty handy. I'm usually too lazy to do that, but it works really well. You can see I've started by filling that in solid. And then I layer some darker colors on top of it before I go on with the paint thinner. Just like I was talking about earlier, where I use multiple colors when building up trees or grass or bushes or anything like that. It's the same thing when working on animals. I'm not going to have one or two perfect colors that is going to work for everything. I'm going to layer multiple colors. You should see the stack of pencils I had down while I was working that I keep out. And it's one of the reasons I don't list out all the colors that I'm using in a piece, because honestly, I probably have 60 colors pulled out. I layer color on top of color on top of color. Now I'm blending this with paint thinner, and you can see at this stage it's very flat, and I'm going to come back through with more layers on top of this. But blending that first time just pushes the pigment into the paper, so I don't have any of those white dots showing through. Although you can kind of see here, I do have some of that grainy texture that I was talking about earlier that I fight with when I work on vellum. Or in this case, that horrible colored pencil paper. Flimsy vellum, that's what they should have called it. I still can't get over watching this, how badly that paper moves every time I touch it. That is so not normal. There's my favorite grayish lavender color, or gray violet, or I don't remember. I'll have to look at which one it is. It's something that I use all the time, so I should let you guys know which color that one is. Inside the nose there, where I wanted it blended very soft, I did tiny little circles. Everyone's going to have their preferred method for laying colored pencil down. Mine, usually, if I want something smooth, I use tiny little circles. When I'm doing fur, then I will use more little lines to where it's going in the direction of the fur. But normally, I like the tiny circles. The point, though, when you're blending with colored pencil or laying that pencil down, don't just scribble randomly everywhere, because those lines sometimes will show through and it doesn't look pretty. No scribbling. I'm assuming I'm sharpening pencils, and that's why we're sitting here watching nothing. There we go. Blending out with paint thinner again. And I will still need many, many more layers on the nose. Pretty much every single area when I'm working isn't finished until the very, very end. I come back and rework everything and do final details. So while I may stop working on the nose for a while or stop working on one of the eyes, I'm going to come back later on once everything else is pretty much blocked in and add my final details then. I added a little bit of blue into the shine on the eye to make it look a little bit more realistic. Now my lavender gray again I've used around the nose. Now you'll see me use the blue a little bit on some of these shadows because I do want to cool them off, but I don't want to go too crazy with the blue on this because there's no blue in the sky, and so it wouldn't make a lot of sense to have tons of blue all over the tiger. So I did go pretty sparingly on that. The chin on tigers or lions, this is another area that you really want to pay a lot of attention to. There is so much little tiny detail going on. You don't want to skip over that. You can see I've blocked in most of my dark areas with the black, but then I'm going to come back through with the whites and the lighter colors. I'm using that white to add some detail around the bridge of the nose as well. When you're working on a colored pencil piece like this that can get really tedious, I know some people will have a hard time sitting still and working on this kind of detail. What I personally do so that I don't get bored and walk away is listen to audiobooks. For this one, I was listening to some Molly Harper books. She has a whole series of vampire and werewolf books that are hilarious. So funny. The first series were the vampire ones that start with Jane Jameson, which those ones they're funny, but I think the narrator, she started to warm up as the series went on. So anyway, it moves on to the Halfmoon Hollow series and then the Dating a Naked Werewolf series. They're so funny. So definitely recommend, though, when you're working on something like this and you've got tiny detail and it gets really, really tedious, find something that can kind of keep your mind focused so that you're not wanting to wander off. For me, it's audiobooks. I used to watch movies a lot while I worked. I listen to music, and while as much as I love music, I find that I don't sit still and work as long as I do when I'm listening to an audiobook. It definitely helps when you've got all of this little tedious work. Now, the fur on the chin, it goes in every which direction. So that's another area. Really, I mean, every area you should pay close attention to your reference photo. But this is really important because that fur is going all over the place. And the shadows hitting the shadow and light is a little bit different than normal on this guy's chin because of the way the light's hitting him. Now, as always, I'm going lighter than I think I'm going to need to go, and I just slowly darken everything up. Still working in between whiskers, trying to keep those as clean as possible. I know they're going to get muddy, but I try to keep them as clean as possible so that they don't get too terribly dark later on. My gray lavender color again. Now, while this area of the tiger's face is white, again, it's not white, I'm using tones of grays and a little bit of blue so that it has a more natural look. The other thing you want to watch when you're doing fur or hair on a tiger, or even on a person, really make sure that you're not just doing a bunch of straight lines. They look too stiff. You can see their whiskers look very stiff. They're not bent very much, but they're supposed to. The fur is softer. You don't want tons of straight lines. They usually will have a slight curve to them. Watch how they clump together. And back to adding more layers on the face. I think if I was using my regular paper, I wouldn't need to add as many layers. I think I would be done at that point. I mean, I would have added as many layers, but I wouldn't keep going back at this point. It just, every time I'd back away and look at it, I realized the color saturation was still really poor. I've put a piece of tracing paper under my hand. I just use masking tape to tape it to the board. Put it under my hand. That way the black lines that I put earlier with the polychromos pencil don't end up smudged or on the side of my hand. I do find with the polychromos, it's more likely to smear onto my hand than any of the wax-based pencils. So with that, it's really important that I keep that tracing paper, or really any paper will work. but keep that under your hand. I use tracing paper because I'm able to see what's underneath it. I'm slowly building up my shadows again. Remember, when you're doing something like this that has tons of detail, don't put detail for the sake of detail. Random detail all over the place is not going to make it look more realistic. If you add detail, make sure that it's correct detail. And the other thing, I stress this all the time too, make sure your drawing is right in the first place. If that means you need to trace it, then trace it, because it's going to help your drawing skills in the long run anyway. But if you don't trace it, you can try the grid method. You can use different dividers and proportional tools, but make sure that your drawing is correct first. That's so important. Because if your drawing is off, it doesn't matter how much work you put into the shading and coloring and blending, it's not going to look right. You have to have that strong foundation of an accurate drawing. And I know a lot of people get all upset, oh my gosh, if you trace it, you're cheating. You're not. You're teaching yourself how to draw more accurately. You're forcing your brain to see how things really are. One of the things that happens so often is we look at something like an eye and we think, okay, I know how an eye looks, and we draw it how we think an eye looks, but that's not really how an eye looks. You want to force yourself to see things accurately. So tracing allows you to do that, and it will strengthen your freehanding skills. The point isn't that you will have to forever trace. The point is to teach your eyes and your brain to see things very, very accurately, to break that preconceived idea in your head of this is what an eye looks like, this is what a nose looks like, and to start forcing yourself to see shapes instead of the object that it is. You can also put your drawing upside down. That helps too, because it kind of tricks your brain into seeing the shapes again instead of the object. In my own classes, I actually have everyone trace whatever it is that they're going to be working on, because again, I know that it is going to strengthen their drawing skills. I've been teaching this way in that method for about 15 years now, and the results have been amazing. I see students learn so much faster if they're tracing things so that they get to where they can freehand it on their own. I have one student right now who I don't have trace in class because her freehanding skills are so strong. But everybody else, I have used the light box in class because it strengthens their drawing skills. And then when we're not spending a lot of class time trying to fix mistakes, the eye's too far to the left, so no matter what we do when we paint it, it's not going to come out right, that sort of thing. So by tracing it, it avoids that and helps them to continue to move forward. And then again, it strengthens their drawing skills. So when you're working on your piece, if you feel that you can't freehand it really accurately, trace it. There is no shame in tracing. It is such a good learning tool. And I've heard people say a lot that if you trace, you're not going to be learning fast and you're limiting yourself. I've been doing it. I've been teaching this way for 15 years, and that is not what I've experienced. Students have learned so much faster and gotten to where they could draw so much more accurately because of that method. Using paint thinner now to blend out some of this. Back to my gray violet color. See, I really do love that color. I use it all the time. I'm adding cream colors into this to warm it up because I think that is the reflection on the tiger's fur. I don't know, but it was a warm color on my reference photo, so I just used the cream color to pull into that white. Now again, around the edges, it's the same thing as I was working on earlier, where you've got to make the edges, if you've used masking fluid and airbrush, so you have those two separate areas, you have to make those areas blend seamlessly. So I spend extra time working on those edges. Mostly I take colors with colored pencil that are similar to the background and just pull it into the white. Now this video is sped up by about 5.5 to 6 times the real-time speed. Again, I said this earlier, but don't rush. When I work, the pencil that I was just using, the white pencil, it was pretty dull. I can leave it dull if one edge is slightly sharp. I just keep turning the pencil. So normally though, you don't want your pencils to be really dull. I usually will tell people to keep sharpening, or tell my students, keep sharpening your pencils. It helps the color to get into all the little crevices of the paper better, and you get cleaner detail. Now, if I'm working on a big blurry background, then I'll let the pencils wear down to where they're not as sharp, so I'm covering more surface area, but normally try to keep your pencil sharp. And again, using that, the word completely slipped my mind. The sandpaper, if you use the sandpaper, you can take a lead that's fairly dull and sharpen it without having to sharpen it in the actual sharpener or with an X-Acto knife. I'm adding white to the light areas again. Still protecting so that when I come on with darker colors, they don't get too dark. Now when I'm blending with the paint thinner, I'm going over some of the whiskers, but like the black areas, I don't go over those really loose. I try to keep it within their own little zone so that the whiskers don't get too dark. Normally when you see me blend with the paint thinner, I use that paint thinner like way too freely over everything, but because I needed those whiskers to stay light, when I did use the paint thinner, I think I switched to a smaller brush and just blended the black without mushing it over the white whiskers. And I'm sorry for the timing being slightly off on this video. This is a bit of a learning experience for me, getting these longer tutorials for you guys. I have found something that will make it, the timing and everything go a little bit more smoothly for next time, so I will be working on that for May's voiceover tutorial. I'm using the white to now start defining those whiskers and creating more of the little hairs coming out over the airbrushed background. And you can see my whiskers that are over the airbrush background. They're kind of messy and fuzzy. I still will have to go over those and clean those up later. Those are not finished. Building more in the fur around the neck. Notice how many different colors I use for this. There's my ink eraser again. I'm pulling out highlights. Because I previously covered everything in white on the area, the white fur, when I use that eraser, it pulls it up, the white back up really well. If I hadn't put it white first, if I put the gray pencil down and then try to erase it, the paper wouldn't come back up white as well as it does if I put white down first, if that makes any sense at all. I need to work on a better way to explain that for you guys. Again, using the white, I'm able to pull out little hairlines without it being white. A lot of the things that people will get frustrated with colored pencil, like the fact that white isn't going to be completely white unless you leave your paper white, can actually be good things too. Once you learn what to expect from the pencils, you'll know how to prepare for things. You'll know what areas you need to leave white. It gets a lot easier with time and practice. Colored pencil is one of the least forgiving mediums, but you will get to where you know what to avoid and what you need to do so that your work comes out just how you want it. Like in the case where I was putting the little white hairs over the dark areas, you wouldn't think that would be the right choice. You would think, I don't want white hairs there, but it's not going to be white. All I'm doing is making a lighter shade of what's already there because that white is translucent. still working in between these whiskers. Right now, all of the colors that I've got on that muzzle almost look like a rainbow, but I will end up blending other colors in with them so that it's not quite so crazy. Putting white down again first, and that whole area that I just put white down, that's going to end up being really, really dark. But because I put the white down first, once I put the grays and everything on top, I'm going to be able to come back through with that eraser or with Scotch masking tape and pull out little detail hairs to lighten them up, and that white that I put down now will be what shows through. Again, if I just put the gray first, I wouldn't be able to get those little white hairs to show through as well. And when I use the white first, I'll usually use a little bit more pressure than I do with other colors. It just helps protect the paper better. Now for this area, I will have to build in the texture of the fur, but I just need to block in the general color. So that's why I just really lightly went over with that kind of tan cream color. I love putting in those dark stripes, those bold stripes. It makes everything look so much better when you're drawing tigers or leopards. Such a huge difference. It's kind of like putting a painting in a frame. It just makes everything look so, it pops out better. Makes all those other colors you were working on stand out. And again, remember, watch the direction of the fur when you're putting in these stripes. You can see how I'm getting that sketchy line, but they have to go in the right direction. And when you're doing these black stripes, they're not just stripes. It's just black fur. Don't think of it so much. I mean, I call it stripes, but don't think of it as solid stripes. I mean, these aren't like stripes you would get on a wall where you've got a hard edge. They've got to be fuzzy. This is dark hair that's peeking out from in between clumps of the lighter colored fur. So you want to make sure that you're recreating that. Adding the grays into the white now. And while I will end up making this much, much darker than I'm doing right now, it is always better to start too light and darken it up as you go than to go too dark and not be able to get it light enough. Using a little bit of that blue. Again, remember, just in this case, I'm going very sparingly with that blue because I don't have any blue in my background. But I do want a cooler gray in parts of these, so that's where that's coming in. I'm using the paint thinner just to kind of push all of these colors into the paper. And then I will start layering on top of that. I'm actually intentionally letting some of that black smudge into the white. It just giving me a darker gray look, which makes it easier for later on. When I'm working on fur like this, I will usually, especially on black, because the black I know will smudge into the colors around it, make sure that you're using the paintbrush in the direction of the fur, so that when you do get those smudges, it just looks like another bit of the fur, like you did it on purpose. I'm using my darker oranges. Now normally when I'm using or creating tires, I don't use these dark oranges so early on. Again, it was just a problem with this paper trying to get that color saturation. But normally I use much, much more muted colors and they come out way more bold than in this case. I'm using these brighter oranges and they're still pretty muted. Are you sick of me listening to me complain about this paper yet? It was just so frustrating because this painting I can't even sell now because the paper was warped so badly. I'll end up, good thing, I mean, I like the design, so it's something that I can hang in my own studio and be content with that, I guess. But it's frustrating to know that I spent all of those days working on this and then I can't sell it. That is a huge, huge issue for me. At least I can make prints out of it. But yeah, the supplies that you use, that it's just so important, because even if it wasn't just an issue of I had to fight with this and couldn't get the color saturation that I wanted, the fact that it's warped like this and that I can't sell it, some people would go ahead and sell it. I'm not comfortable with that. It's important to me that what I sell is archival and lasts. So I don't want someone getting something and then 6 months later when the humidity was high, the whole paper starts to reshape. That's not okay to me. So that is the same thing when I'm working with colored pencils, and why it's important to me to use light fast colors. I don't want someone coming back in a few months or a few years and going, why did this completely change color? It faded because I cheaped out and used poor quality pencils. Cough, Prismacolor. Some of Prismacolor pencils are actually light fast, so you wouldn't have to worry about it, but you want to look those up. They've got a color chart, or you have to go online to find it, but they'll let you know which ones are light fast and which ones aren't, and so many of the Prismacolor ones aren't. Same thing with a lot of brands. I know Derwent Color Soft, it's the same thing. They had a lot of colors that weren't light fast. So stuff like that, the supplies that you're using, you want to watch. If you're keeping it for yourself and you're practicing, it's not as big of a deal. But if you're going to be selling your work, then it really is. Now, of course, if you're using colors that aren't light fast, you can get UV protectant glass. It's expensive. You may as well just use pencils that aren't going to fade, but there are options for you out there. They have UV protectant sprays you can use too. I haven't personally used them, so I'm not sure what the results are on those, but you do have options. But when you think that you're saving money by getting Prismacolors or some of these colors that aren't light fast, you have to keep in mind all of the other products that you have to purchase to make those last a bit longer. So just stuff to keep in mind. Working again on the fur, paying attention to the direction. Now, you can't really tell easily here, but the pencil that I'm using right now is actually a dark brown by Luminance that I'm going in between the areas of the stripes. Normally on tigers and on leopards, the black doesn't just go black to the orange or black to the tan or brown color that the animal is. It usually will fade so that it goes black to a reddish brown color and then to the main orange tan color, whatever color you're going for. But you get that fading from black to the orange. So in this case, I'm using a brown color around the edges between my black and the tan colors, and then I'm using a reddish brown in between that brown and the orange color. So I'm fading colors. You don't just want it to jump from black to tan or black to orange. Usually you'll have a little bit of a border there with that second or third color. Using my black polychromos that is sharpened to a nice point so that I can get some more detail in the ear. See, I wasn't kidding when I said I jump around a lot as I work. But I'll have an area mostly finished, I'll work onto another area and then see that previous area. It makes it easier to see things that I need to adjust. Not everybody's mind works that way though, so don't feel like you have to do it that way. If you can get an entire area done and then move on to the next area and get that area done, that's fine too. I'm working on recording podcasts right now for a colored pencil, and my co-host, or am I the co-host? I don't know what you want to call him. John Middick is the guy that I'm working with for those podcasts. And he was saying that when he works on the whole thing. So where he puts in one color, he puts it on the whole. He does a lot of portraits. He will put the whole portrait is covered with that base color and then builds up the whole portrait. So he works on the nose, the cheek, the forehead, the chin, everything's at the same time. Whereas I work on everything separately with forehead, nose, cheek. They're all done in separate sections. So there's no one right or wrong way. It completely depends on what works best for you. All of our minds are going to see things a little bit differently. So if you see an artist that's doing something one way, give it a try and see if you like it, but don't feel like you have to do it that way. If that way doesn't work for you or you don't like that method, you can use a totally different one. There are no set rules. I'm pulling up details with the blacks and the grays into the white, just really creating the texture of that fur. You don't want this to look flat, so that's where it's really important to get all these little details of the fur. Back to laying down white first for this area. Now I can come on top of that with some of the other colors. Using my black again to define my edges. As perfect as your line drawing may be, if your hair is going in the wrong direction, it will completely change the look of the tiger and not in a good way. So make sure that that fur is going, fur or hair, if you're doing people, it has to go the right direction. If you just put straight lines all over, if it's going the wrong direction, you'll end up creating a very flat looking tiger or whatever it is that you're working on. I start feeling really bad about talking for an hour, but then keep reminding myself, you guys can just mute me. My husband wishes he had that feature. On to the neck. The neck is a lot darker except for this highlight on the back of the neck. So I'm going to use darker oranges than I did on the forehead. I can start out a lot darker because he's in the shadow there. He needs a lot more color. So I can block that in, and I'm being very messy here. I'm not really worrying about the directions of the fur because that's just a base color. I'm going to come back on with the darker areas, or the darker pencils, to create the actual texture. Now the neck here, the side of the neck, this was actually a lot of work and a lot more tedious than pretty much any other area of the tiger. Normally it's the chin and the ears that kind of drive me crazy, or they're just tedious. But on the back section of the neck, it looks like there's a lot of stripes where I've got those black bits, but those aren't stripes. It's just texture of the fur where it's kind of clumped together more. And so creating that look was a bit of a challenge. It just took a lot longer. So you have to really watch your reference photo. Here on the white, again, I'm adding my darker colors. I need to order another one of those lavender grays. I use it so often, I'm going to go through it way too fast. That's one thing. When you get colored pencils, for me, it is really important that those pencils can be purchased open stock or individually. I get them online from either Jerry's Artorama or dickblake.com, depending on who has the better sale or coupon that day. But you need to be able to buy them individually because there are certain colors, like in this case, that lavender gray color, I go through like crazy, or violet gray. I really need to pause this and go look to see what color that is for you guys. But I go through that one really fast and I go through white really fast. So I need to be able to buy those individually. So when you're buying colors, I know a lot of brands out there that are questionable anyway because of light fastness issues. But even if the pencil was amazing, if you can't buy them individual, then to me, it's kind of pointless because there are colors you are going to go through crazy fast. You don't want to have to buy a full set every time you need to replace one color. Here is where I start to have to really watch my shapes on that neck like I was talking about a few minutes ago. Now I am using black for in between these shadows, but I'm going to come back through and better define those with browns and reds on top of it. This whole area is going to be very dark, so I can get away with starting with black. Now, I personally love black, whether it be for my paintings or for my colored pencil work. I use black a lot, and a lot of artists don't like to. That is completely up to you, but you do want to watch when you're using black. Don't overdo it. In this case, I know I need to be able to, in most of these areas, go over it with another color. So I don't want to start burnishing right off the bat and not be able to have the paper take additional colors because it would look too flat. Right now, those lines that I have in the neck kind of look like little worms. You don't want to leave them that way. This section I'm working on now, again, these aren't black stripes. These are clumps of fur that are separated. And so I'm using a lighter hand than I do on the areas that are actual black stripes. Now I'm coming back over all of this with that reddish brown, darkening everything up. And again, I'm being very messy. I'm not worrying about the direction of my fur here. I'm just getting that base color in there. You can see the paper still moving like crazy as I work. This area that I'm working on right now is one of the areas that warped worse than anywhere else. Why? I can't tell you. And blending that out with paint thinner. Now I've got to start creating those actual clumps. I'm using a cream color and really defining the actual direction of the fur and these little clump areas. I have to make it look like clumps of fur and not just random lines all over, and that was the challenge here. A lot of this fur is going in completely different directions. Yes, every single one of my fingernails was painted a different color. But I used the same stamp on all of them, so it tied it together nicely. I have got to get used to pausing the camera before I adjust angles. So again, building up the little direction of the fur with that light pencil. Now this can get overwhelming when you're working on fur and getting the texture like this. This is an area that I usually will have students break it down 1 inch at a time. Work on 1 square inch until it's pretty much finished and then work on the next square inch. The reason is because it gets so overwhelming, you can end up just having random lines everywhere. So if you work on it in smaller sections to create those shapes, that'll make it a lot easier for you. And then as you finish each square inch, when that whole area is done, then I'll go back through and add additional shading and details. But just for getting those main shapes blocked in when you're drawing out, in this case, I had some lines drawn out, but most of those I had to freehand in. I had to really pay close attention to my reference photo. So if you can break it down into small sections at a time, it will seem less overwhelming to you. As much as I like contrast, not everywhere needs to have high contrast. That's why you saw me come back through with that kind of golden color to fade the orange into the white. Now I'm adding the shadows. I believe here I am using a dark brown, not black. It looks kind of black in the video. These are not the tiger stripes. These are just shadowed areas for the first clumping. As you're working on something like this, when it gets really tedious, take breaks. I take a lot of breaks because if you stare at it too long, you're just seeing these random shapes and it can get kind of confusing. So I personally sit here and will just step away from the painting. I play little games on my phone or something like just something to look at something different. Walk away, walk into another room, and then come back to it. Blending out with paint thinner. And I don't want those black sections or the shadows to be real sharp, so I went right over everything with the paint thinner. I let that paint thinner mush the blacks and the reddish colors together. Blending some of the hairs on the white with paint thinner, and again going in the direction of the fur in most of these cases so that when I get streaks, they are going the right direction. Now I am adding even more highlights. I'm using a slightly darker color for this than I did initially. back to the chin, and to protect that area from getting smudged, I put the tracing paper back over the neck. And now this is the point where I just start skipping around the entire piece and doing touch-ups where needed. Adjusting color, adjusting detail, getting my contrast where it needs to be. And I'll just keep backing up away from the piece to see where I need to work on. This is also the stage where I'll take photos, load it into Photoshop, and put it next to my reference photo to decide if I need adjustments. Now, I'm not always going to try to make it exact to the reference photo. Sometimes I may decide I want colors lighter or darker, and that's totally okay. But when making sure that I've got the outline drawn right and that sort of thing, it's easier to see when it's right next to, when the photo of my work is next to the reference photo in Photoshop. Reworking some of these whiskers, and I've got to use a darker color and clean up my edges so that they stand out more. And it's not that I'm outlining them, it's that I'm creating more of a contrast, more shadow underneath them so that the whiskers stand out more. Notice all the clumps of fur. They're not just individual random lines. You can see so many areas where I've got random, like these weird shapes with the white where the fur is clumped together. That is so important. You don't want just a lot of confetti lines. This neck, I had to back away from it so many times because you really easily and quickly lose your place on the look that you're trying to create. It feels more random than the fur in any other place, so that was really important for me to keep backing away. Few final highlights, and I will be done. That's about it. Just these little tiny details. Keep backing away from the piece and deciding if you need more contrast in various areas. So I hope you enjoyed your April voiceover tutorial for this Patreon video. And again, our next milestone, once I can upgrade my computer will be able to handle it better, so I can do these more often. It is not happy about these large files and voiceovers on top of it. Thanks for watching, guys, and thanks again for being supporters.